One of the first things you learn doing reviews is that there are 5 types of reviews and there is only one rule. The rule is be honest. Everything else follows from that. The 5 types of reviews that you get asked to do are interesting, and you're probably only aware of 2 of them. The first is the product that you're sent that is so bad that you cannot think of a single good thing to say about it. That goes back to the person that sent it to you. We don't review those. Then there's the piece of equipment that is mostly bad, and there are a couple of good things that you can scrape together. But after thinking about it, on balance, it's worse than it is good. They go back as well. I don't want to do bad reviews. People aren't going to be interested unless it's a very popular piece of equipment. Then the third and fourth kind of reviews are the ones that you do see me doing. They're the ones that are either right down the middle, 50-50 pros and cons. They're the most fun to do because that way I get to look at all of the good and the bad about this product and come up with a balanced recommendation. Then there are the rare pieces of equipment that are almost completely good. There's very little bad that you can say about them. But it's good reviewmanship to take the time to find out a couple of the negatives about a product so that you can give a balanced review, so that you can tell people everything that you found out about it. And that's just good practice, so long as you're honest. The fifth kind of review is only theoretical. Because we have a no redeeming features category, number 1, we also have to have a number 5. That's the perfect product, the product that doesn't have anything wrong with it. And we never talk about those because we never see them. And I've never done one until now. So when Novoflex sent me the Castel-Micro rail and invited me to do a review on the piece of equipment, I went into it assuming that it was going to be a strong number 4 type review, that it was going to be mostly fantastic and that there were going to be some negatives. And my job was to find the negatives, find out how negative they were, and experience them by using the equipment, and then report back to you on what they were. So for the last 6 weeks, that is what I have done. I started out doing what anybody would do, going after the low-hanging fruit. The first thing you want to look at when you receive a new product is what kind of packaging does it come in? Is it well packed? Is it safely packed? Is it packed to protect the equipment inside? Is it labeled properly to protect the equipment? All of these things. My first impression when I looked at the box was, boy, I wish they'd sent us home with our first child wrapped as nicely as this. Because she wasn't wrapped that nicely. She was in a bit of a mess, actually, coming back from the hospital. So it was impressive. This box was inside a box, was inside a box. It was like Russian nesting dolls, and there was padding between every layer. And on the inside was the rail laid out beautifully with all the accessories you need to make it work, with all the papers, all the manuals, everything you need to get started was right there, right where you wanted it. Nothing was wrinkled or bent or out of place, and nothing had been previously opened. That, to me, is these days, it's one of the guaranteed ways that you are going to get points taken off in a review is when I open the box and the piece of equipment that I'm getting is supposedly new and it has been used. Now, this obviously affects me a lot more when I just bought the piece of equipment and find out it's used. But it happens so regularly now that it's almost a guaranteed con to add to the list. This didn't look like it had been touched by humans. In fact, it looked like it had been made and packed by aliens because it was spotless, absolutely spotless. Everything was in its own little bag, labeled, sealed, and yeah, so I wasn't able to give it any negative points for packaging. I thought about giving it one negative point because it was delivered to my neighbor by mistake, but it seemed a bit unfair to take a point off Novoflex because of the post office, so we'll let that one slide. The next category that is considered low-hanging fruit in my book is testing. The testing sounds a lot more complicated than it is. We do it in 3 separate steps, but we're really asking just one question. And that is, does the rail do the one job that we need it to do? Does it move the subject the distance it's supposed to, and does it do it consistently and repeatedly throughout the stack? The setup that I'm using to test this particular rail is something you've seen before. It's fairly straightforward, actually. It's my Nikon D850 with a very powerful 50 times microscope objective type lens fitted directly to the camera, and it's all mounted on a rail. It's actually mounted on a platform that I drive with a rail, but it's driven by a stack shot. Now, the stack shot's not going to be doing anything. The camera is going to be static. It's going to stay in the position it's in now, and it is focused using the stack shot onto a small piece of very, very fine sandpaper. This is sandpaper with a grit of about 1000, so it is it's hard to see any surface irregularities on it, but under the lens system I have, you can see very clearly all the irregularities and marks that my tracking will use in the focus stacking program. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold the camera and lens stable while moving the subject in front of the lens using the focusing rail that we're testing. In this case, it's the Castel-Micro by Novoflex. And this rail is extraordinary in that it is very silent, very accurate, and it claims to be able to step at 0.2 microns. That is 1/5 of a micron, and that is a very small step indeed. That would allow you to very comfortably use an objective like this, a 50 times objective, to take photographs of a subject if it could really move those tiny steps. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the rail up so that it will move in front of the lens a specific number of steps. I've set the step length at 0.2 microns, and I've set a start and a finish point that are only a very short distance apart, but it will take 1054 shots to move about 1 millimeter, and in the process that will gather all of the information that we need to test whether or not it's really taking steps that short, or if they are some other length or some other mixture of steps. We'll just have to see. Basically, what we found was what we would expect. At 100 and at 10 microns, the data was pretty good. The noise was pretty low. The signal was pretty bright. And we got a fairly consistent stepping of the right distance. There was fluctuation. There is always fluctuation. Friction in the lead screw, or friction on the linear bearings. Any number of things, even dirt on the rail, can slow the stepper down for a given step. What we didn't see was any kind of cyclic periodicity which would suggest the lead screw was bent, or there was some other physical problem interfering with movement of the rail. That was all normal. Where things started to go a bit on the wonky side was when we got down to 1 micron. 1 micron and below, the noise to signal ratio became a little bit onerous, and it was difficult. It was really difficult to pass the difference between the noise that we were clearly measuring and the movement of the rail. And the end result was I couldn't call it either way. I couldn't say whether or not these steps were within a satisfactory range. But I did do some research and found out that Novoflex had actually done this at their own lab. It's not their lab, it's a private lab that was the only one they found in their part of Germany that can actually do this kind of testing. So it is not something that's commonly done. This lab they were able to test it with a very good signal to noise ratio down to 0.2 microns, and they gave it a clean bill of health. So for all of those words, the bottom line is no points were lost on the testing. And when we get to the end of testing, things then get a little bit hairier, because we then have to start relying on judgment and taking some pictures. And that's what I started doing. I started a 6-week period of taking pictures every day with this rail. And I photographed a lot of beetles that month. I didn't find any evidence of any of the things that you'll occasionally uncover in a rail that will be cause for concern. I'm going to talk about the actual performance of the rail in just a second when I show it to you. But in the meantime, I'm going to just have to have you take my word for it that there was no evidence that there was anything mechanical or untoward going on. As far as I can tell, the rail has no backlash, which is virtually impossible. Well, maybe it is impossible. There was simply no visual evidence of anything negative about the rail's performance. So now we're stuck with stuff like what it looks like, what it feels like, what kind of vibe it gives off, what the people at the company are like, what the aftermarket service is like. So we'll get into that in just a second. But first, I want to show you how this rail is set up. Now, this is going to be very brief because I have a second video showing you how this is done indoors, and then a third video where I take the thing outside and show you how to use it out in nature, the same way that Robert Thompson does. But for now, let's go back in the studio. Let's have a look at the basic setup, and I'll show you just how slick this thing is in operation. I apologize for the mess, but I was getting set up in here, and I thought I'd show you just a couple of the design features of the Novoflex that I find particularly helpful, and I'm glad that it has. The first concerns the base plate here, the Arca Swiss locking, rotating base plate. It has a screw in the middle of it that takes a fairly standard sized hex screw, but I'm not exactly sure what size it is. I guess I could read this screwdriver and tell you. Normally all you'd do would be to loosen it, lift the base and rotate it through 90 degrees, and it'll fall back and lock in place. But my problem was the indexing pin that I'm about to show you was sticking up, and it was getting in the way of the rail I was trying to mount. That is the screw that I'm talking about. And unlike any other plate I've ever seen, this one you can actually access with a small screwdriver, and you can advance or retract the pin as far as you want it. It's a safety pin to prevent the Novoflex shoe from sliding off. But I wasn't using the Novoflex shoe, I was using a long rail that was centered on this, and it happened to just fall right on that pin. So rather than compromise on the camera position, I went ahead and lowered the pin, and it fits perfectly. I just need to remember when I put it back to put the pin back in its position, and then this will very positively slot back into place and tighten very easily. If you don't have one of these tools that has 58 different star, whatever they call it, points on the end, get one. They'll save your life. Now, you're probably noticing the odd arrangement here. I have first of all, I'm on a continuous motion type base on linear bearings. This is a type of focus stacking that I do a lot, but in this case I wanted a static base. So I've just mounted the rail directly onto this moving base, and then I bolted the base down so it won't move temporarily. But the thing is, the way this large motor rests, it needs a bit of clearance down below. So what I did was I took a piece of aluminum stock and drilled it out from below, put two very short 1/4 inch bolts into the bottom. They don't even come through the holes in the top. They just bottom out right on the surface of the rail. And that holds the aluminum plate in place. And then I screwed that to these two pieces of very, very hard wood that they're like steel. And this thing mounts perfectly flat. And I've checked all the angles, and it is completely flat and straight. So it's a good setup, but it is temporary. I can remove it with the 4 screws. A lot of rails simply don't give you that amount of flexibility, because there's also a 5/8 hole under there I could have used, but it worked perfectly for this. And the fact that there is this line, this ridge of metal here that you can use to index a perpendicular line allows you to help position the rail completely straight. I love that. The next thing I love is how the wiring is so sparse. You have one stretchy cable to the camera, so it stays completely out of the way on the right-hand side. The Cat 6 or whatever that they're using to connect the motor with the controller stays out of the way. It's coiled, and it wants to stay coiled, so it easily stays where it's put. Then the other thing that I love is that they thought to put a 1/4 20 screw hole, bolt hole in the base of the controller. I love to have my controllers up off the surface of the worktop, because they get knocked over, things get spilt on them or dropped on them. This is much more convenient, much easier to use, and it just suits me to a T. I just put it in a little articulating clamp, and I can do all of my controls without worrying about the controller getting damaged. That's just calibrating the rail. We're going to talk about this a little later on, but there are 4 different methods that you can use: step, picture, continuous, and bellows. Really, if you think about it, there are only 2. There's step and picture. Step is where you designate a step number in microns, and picture is where you designate a number of pictures in the extent of travel. But seeing as you have to calculate the number of pictures by the step length, it seems a bit redundant for me that you'd even need this, because, I mean, if you're going to do this properly, you know what your step length is to know how many pictures there are in that distance. If you're traveling a centimeter and you want a picture every millimeter, you know that that's 10 steps. So to calculate the number of pictures, you had to know the step length. It seems easier to just enter the step length and let the device do the math for you. That's the way I always will do it. I'll let the device figure out how far the distance is, because I'll tell it where to start, where to stop, and then I'll enter in the step length that I want, because that's the only thing that is really ultimately going to have any impact on the quality of your image. Well, that's not true. There's a lot of things that could impact the quality of your image, but the most important thing you don't want to mess up is something as basic as the step length, which is a function of your aperture and your magnification, and it's easy to calculate. If you don't want to calculate it, just use a table to find the depth of field, and then establish a step length from there. But once you get a step length in, and if you're not using mirror up, which I have actually stopped using because of this. When I first got this, it was recommended in the handbook to use live view, which basically turns it into a mirrorless camera. And I had never really thought to do that, because I was always concerned about battery life. But I've started doing it, and I much prefer it because it's a lot quicker. So I leave the mirror up off. I put in my delay, which for most things is about 3 or 4 seconds. And that's not because of the settling time, which doesn't need to be nearly that long on a rail like this, which barely vibrates. It's for the flash. I need my flash to have as much time as it takes. So we'll say 5 seconds. I don't care if the stack takes 40 minutes to shoot, so long as the flashes fire every single time, and they will at 5 seconds. So there's no shutter up to worry about, and the settings have already been loaded. So then I'll go to the settings tab. That's where I'll put in my start point and my end point. This is a bit trickier. There's no camera on here, so we'll pretend. First of all, sorry, you're going to position the camera where you want it, close to the start of your shot. So you're looking at your live view, you have your subject lined up, and I usually go in the fast mode just because it's so much quicker. Normally I would have this tip back a bit, but I want you to be able to see it. And then I'll move the rail forward while I'm looking at the screen until the first part of the image starts to come into focus. And then I'll pause. I'll go to the slower speed, actually usually the middle speed. I'll look at the screen again and I'll nudge the rail forward. You can hardly hear it, it's so quiet, until I get to just before I'm ready to start shooting, which will be the thing that's closest to the camera is just coming into focus. Then I'll hit the start button, and that sets the position as the start. Now what I'm going to do, before I move the rail at all, I'm going to hit end and then move the rail. And you'll see it's moving the end point but leaving the start point where it was. So when I get just beyond the last thing I want to have in focus, I stop moving the rail, come back up and hit end. That, plus the fact that I need to enter my step length. Let's say we're shooting at 10 times magnification and I want to use a step length of 11 microns. That's going to be a big stack because I moved that rail a long way. So I always hit clear because I like a blank screen to start with, and I'll just put in 0, 1, 0. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I set my step length at 10 microns, and that gives me the number of steps that it's going to take, and it'll calculate how long when we go to the next page. So that's really all there is to it. If you do the number of pictures in the distance thing, you need to measure your start and stop point so that it'll calculate the distance. And then to tell it how many pictures you want, you don't randomly just pick a number of pictures. You pick a depth of field that you're trying to shoot to, and then you'll enter that number once you calculate the number of shots. So this is a lot easier. The other two modes, by the way, and we'll go back to them very briefly. The continuous mode is just as it sounds. The rail moves continuously as it acquires shots. Not something I've had a lot of luck with, but then again, I use a lot of high magnification stuff, and that might not be the best choice. And then bellows is actually just a combination of what you can use either one of these two. So it's really a setting where you just pick either the distance or the number of steps. I'm not quite sure I understand it, to be honest. When I used my own homemade rear bellows focus rig, I just used step again, which is always going to be my preference because it just makes sense. Okay, so let's go back to where we were. We were in step, 5 seconds, and we did all that. We set our distance of 10 microns, calculated at 166 steps. We go to the stacking page. This is the last page, and these are so basic. It's crazy. There is a countdown if you want it. Why not? Let's do a countdown. Let's get a 5-second countdown. And save settings have already been saved. It tells us it's going to take 20 minutes, 167 shots, no delay, and it tells us the actual steps because it calculates different step length than we put in based on how short the steps can be taken by the motor. If that makes any sense, when you press start, the rail will go back to the beginning, absolutely silently, almost silently, and then it will start the 5-second countdown, followed by a move of 10 microns. I don't know if you can hear or see that. It's one of the other things I wanted to show you. This rail is remarkable in how quiet and beautifully it functions. The noise of my air conditioner is drowning out the noise of the motor moving the rail, but it is moving. If you want to pause or stop the stack for any reason, you punch the red button and it will allow you to resume it. Now this is a breakthrough that I can't believe nobody else has come up with. Well, that's not true. I think the Wii Macro lets you pause, but pausing is so common. I mean, for example, when my air conditioner comes on, if I'm standing here, I'm going to immediately pause the stack and go turn the fan off, because that will cause the room to vibrate. So anyway, that's all there is to it. The rest of this setup, by the way, was just a rail with some extension tubes and a D850 DSLR. And I had to be very careful because the DSLR would not clear the motor. I could have built up the rail, but I didn't want the center of gravity any higher. So I just had to mount the rail pretty far forward, which I don't like doing, but it was a very light rail with a very light tube set and a small objective on the end. So anyway, that's what I wanted to show you. This is going bye-bye in a very short period of time. So I'm coming out here and stacking at night and in the morning and in the afternoon. And I'm going to keep taking pictures until they come take it away from me, which, like I say, is any day now. But it's the best rail you're ever going to see. I cannot imagine anybody will ever make a more precise, beautifully engineered piece of stacking equipment. It's just phenomenal. And it's been a joy and a privilege to get to use it. Brilliant, brilliant piece of kit, this. I said this when we were back there, but from a usage standpoint, there simply isn't an easier rail to use. It's incredibly intuitive and simple. The rail claims to have 4 different modes, and I guess you could say that it does. It really has 2 modes. It has a step mode and a distance mode. And, they're both really, at the end of the day, the same, in that you have to calculate the step in order to determine the distance if you're using distance mode, or you just need to use the step length if you're using the step mode. So I'm not really sure that I understand this difference that so many rail companies use. I'm just not quite sure why they do it, because it doesn't save you any time. You still have to do the same calculation to get the same result. For example, you wouldn't ever take a look at a subject and think, well, that rail's going to move 5 millimeters, and today I want to take 30 photographs. You would never do that. You would always measure the distance and divide that by the step length to get the number of steps you need. The number of steps you need is something you calculate, not something you just choose. Yeah, I'm not quite sure why they have both of those modes listed. And actually, the other 2 modes are also derivatives of sorts. The continuous mode is just as it sounds. The motor runs continuously and takes pictures on the way. And the last mode, the bellows mode, is a little bit confusing because it's really just the step mode and the distance mode. And you pick which one you want while you're in there, which is what you'd do if you weren't in there. So I don't really understand it. But I'm not going to take any points off, because I'm sure that somebody smarter than me understood it when they set it up. And the software is flawless. The calculations are done fast and accurately. The interface is a touch screen, and it's beautiful and it works. I have one bone of contention with the whole controller issue, but I'm not going to give it even one demerit, because I see why they did it. I just don't like it. Anytime you power down the unit and you get ready to take another series of shots, you have to power it back up again. And whenever you turn it on, you have to calibrate the rail. Now, in the studio, it doesn't really bother me to hold the button down for a minute while it pulls the motor back, touches the limit switch, and sets its calibration point. I get that. It's not that big a deal. When you're outdoors and you're trying to conserve battery and you're turning the rail off after each stack, only to have to recalibrate again, especially if you're working towards the front of the rail, that becomes a little bit irritating. But it becomes a little bit irritating so that the rail can remain as accurate as it does. So it would be, I think, a little bit churlish to take a point off for that. I don't care for it, but you know, there's other things I don't care for that aren't necessarily bad, and I'm going to let that one slide. So we're left with the looks of the thing, the styling, and anybody who knows Novoflex knows that the main feature that attracts people to them in the first place is their impeccable styling and their choice of a company color. This mix of blue and gray is an absolute perfect color for photographic equipment. I really love it. And it works so well. It's so understated and very calming. The controller, as you can see, is nothing but a gray box with a blue button, and everything else is touch screen. It's laid out beautifully. It only has a place to plug in the power, a place to plug in the Cat 5 cable that connects it to the motor, and that's it. The back also has a plastic battery holder, which I didn't like at first. But after now using this in the field a bunch of times, I realized I didn't want that to be metal. After lugging all of that stuff through the woods for an hour, it was fine just the way it was. It operates off Canon camera batteries, which is a strange choice. They told me why they did it, and I can't remember what they said. The styling is absolutely flawless. It really is. I know that some people are going to complain about the way the motor, which is really large for the small rail, bulges down on the underside. And I was concerned about that too. And I raised that point when I interviewed Martin. I asked him specifically about the position of the motor and how it could be a little inconvenient down at the bottom where it forms a ridge, makes it a little hard to mount on a flat surface. Turns out that the reason they do that is so that they can avoid using any gears at all in the system. The shaft then is a direct extension of the stepper motor. It's not geared like it is in most other rails. So the energy is not being transmitted through any gear train, so there isn't any space for you to develop sloppiness, which could result in backlash, or stiction or any other abnormality that could affect the accuracy of the stacking. It doesn't do that. It is a direct motor to lead screw setup. The rail also uses linear bearings, which is an altogether new thing for me to see on a consumer type stacking rail. It has high-end, hand-placed, machined linear bearings on either side, quite spread apart, and they carry all the weight of the carriage. The lead screw is small, but it's a very, very tight pitch. The whole body is a solid piece of aluminum that has been carefully machined, and the specs on the Arca Swiss rails on both sides are impeccable. It's absolutely beautiful to look at and beautiful to hold. It's balanced right around the point at which you would put it on a tripod, which is attention to detail if ever there was. It would be very common for a rail like this to have a very eccentric center of gravity, leading to problems in the field. But this thing is just perfect. All you have to do is mount it towards the midpoint, right where the motor basically tells you to, and it balances perfectly. It can handle anything I could put on it. I was doing a video just the other day, and I put the heaviest macro lens that I had on the heaviest camera, and I tipped the thing into vertical orientation and stacked with it, and it never so much as hesitated. So we're getting pretty much to the end of the things that I would look to take a point or two back. And it was beginning to look like this rail was headed for solid 5 territory. I'd already spoken to Martin, who is the second in command at Novoflex. I'd interviewed him at his office in Germany, and we'd had a great interview. He's a nice guy, charming, very forthcoming. He knows everything about the equipment, had answers to all of my questions. He was unapologetic about the quality of the equipment, and was completely standing behind what his company claims about the equipment, which is it's the best. He wasn't just talking about the rails. He also was talking about the tripods and the tripod heads and all the other things that Novoflex makes. So I was left with the very thin straw of finding something wrong with their factory or their people or their employees. They only have 37 employees, and I've looked at some video of the company at work, and yeah, they're not getting points taken off. You could eat your lunch off the floor of that plant, and it's in beautiful shape. It's in a beautiful city in Germany, one of the most picturesque cities in the whole country. So no points there either. And I was about ready to give up when a thought occurred to me that I had not thought of this whole time. And it was such a slam dunk. It was such an obvious win for me, a negative that I could come up with in an instant. The price. This rail costs $3,000.
This discussion of price is kind of difficult, so I came up on the hill to think about it. The whole concept of price and value, for that matter, are very, I guess, subjective is the best way to put it. We like to think in terms of objective pricing. You know, we say that a loaf of bread costs, what does a loaf of bread cost? $14 now? And that's something that we can use as a reference. We can hang our hats on that. We know that a loaf of bread is around $14 or whatever it is. I should probably know that, shouldn't I? Anyway, the thing is this, when we're talking about a piece of photographic equipment, if it's something that is in the rarefied kind of environment that Novoflex is in, it's very hard to put a meaningful objective price on it, because the price or the value of the piece of equipment is really what people will pay for it. I'm sure that it has an absolute value in terms of, or an absolute price, in terms of the raw materials, the time, the salaries of the people that made it, the taxes, the shipping, all of that stuff. You add it all up and you come up with a number. And that is fairly meaningless because it doesn't really form a very realistic price basis. But what does is the historical record of what that thing has sold for. So in the case of this rail that costs $3,000, you sit it next to a rail that costs $300. And somebody actually got in touch with me last week and asked me this very question. And hopefully you'll understand in a minute why it's such an impossible question to answer. The question was, is this rail worth 10 times what the Wii Macro is worth, or what the Wii Macro costs? And the point I'm trying to make here is that I can't answer that question for you. I can only answer that question for me. That's what subjective means. It's not something that has a basis in objective fact. So, you know, we could argue that the Wii Macro costs, you know, 30 cents to make, and the Novoflex costs $30 to make, but it doesn't get us any closer to a truth here. And that truth is, what is the value of this device to you? Because if you're willing to pay $3,000 for it, then by definition, it's worth $3,000 because that's what you paid for it. So I can't answer the question of, is this expensive and fairly unique piece of photographic gear worth what they're charging for it? Only you can, because worth is something that you calculate for your own set of circumstances. When we look at the Novoflex rail, it costs, what is it, $1,200 or $1,100 less in Europe than it does in the US. Does that mean it's a better value in Europe? Well, there's absolutely no way to tell until you figure out the cost of living in that particular country, the average annual incomes, the cost of manufacturing and shipping, and the cost savings of not having to ship overseas and pay all of those other government fees. So it makes no sense to compare the price of something that is made in the country that you're buying it from and the price where you are, because there are too many factors that are going to confound any understanding of that. Well, that's not true. You can figure out what those costs are, but it's still going to, at the end of the day, leave you with a significant difference. Think about it this way. When you're trying to make sense of a price difference between Germany and the US on something like this rail, don't think in absolute terms. Don't compare $1,800 to $3,000. Instead, think there is a price in Germany for whatever reason, and there's a price here. Now, I happen to believe that the difference is justifiable. So you end up with a price of $3,000 versus $1,800. For that difference to make any sense at all, you have to say to yourself, okay, if I move to Germany, get a job in Germany, get a house in Germany, and you know, my income stabilizes over a period of time, and I can now buy that rail for 1,800 Deutschmarks or whatever it is, euros, then you've got a fairly realistic comparison. But we don't have that information, so you don't know what 1,800 means in dollars. It's just a number. It doesn't really reflect the value of the object. It just reflects the bottom line. And you know, the bottom line might be these people in this town make half what you do, in which case it's a terrible deal in Germany. You're way better off getting it here for $3,000. When you're looking at price, instead of looking at part of the question, which is how much does this thing cost, try looking at the whole question, which is this thing worth $3,000 to me today? If the answer is, yeah, I absolutely want it and I'm willing to pay $3,000 for it, then it's worth it. You're getting value for your money. And if it's not, or if you are questioning it, don't get it. If it feels like it's too much money, you've answered your question. I don't think the price comparison that we're all throwing about, me included, is a valid argument. I really just don't think it is. Until you fill in all the other information that would give you some feel for the value, it's pointless. So, what was your question? Is it worth it? Of course it's worth it. Buy it.
Well, that finally brings us to the end of this review. I know it's been a long and convoluted process, but it's been a journey of discovery with this rail. I've had it now for 6 weeks and it's going back today. And I am going to miss it because it is a superb piece of equipment. You don't need a rail to focus stack. You don't need an expensive rail to take good pictures. But when you have one, you take more good pictures. For several reasons. Having this rail made me want to focus stack again. I hadn't been doing much. I can only imagine what the rest of their line of equipment must look like, given how intoxicating this rail is. If you're in the market for a focus stacking rail and you can afford the high price, because it is a high price, then I would buy it without hesitation. This rail gets my fullest and most complete endorsement that I've ever given. There is no reservation in this whatsoever, and that includes the price, which I think is fair. So I hope that those of you who are in the market and interested in getting one are able to do so. And I know for a fact you will enjoy it as much as I did, because it's hard not to. It's beautiful. I wish all of you well. I would like to thank Novoflex for their hospitality and their generosity in lending me this rail for so long. There is a very good chance I will have my hands on the Castel-M, the manual rail, soon. And if I do, you'll be hearing about it. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Goodbye.